a 15-minute call with the person who can give you $11 million for your project. How much is that conversation really worth? Because that $11 million is going to create billions of value for the company.
Daniel Stillman designs conversations for a living.
He works with clients and organizations of all shapes and sizes.
As a coach for leaders and teams, he specializes in creating conditions for transformative conversations.
For anybody listening who's had a conversation, I think there's always this tension between doing too much and doing too little.
But how do you operationalize that so somebody can understand what being present in a conversation means?
Focus, but the question then becomes focus on what?
With such a variety of topics, how do you make sure that you're going to actually get the most out of it?
Simplicity and directness. Now, if somebody's coming to you and saying, like, can you do an overall assessment of my podcast? I think it's one of the best ways to give anybody feedback.
How long does it actually take to learn all this and to make it part of your natural self?
You need to change how you think. I think one of the challenges is with conversation is that people...
Daniel, how do you get your clients to listen to you whilst they are drinking pina colada on a beach in Cancun?
Well, thanks for the callback. I think if I asked them to do it, then it wouldn't. It's like, here's your homework. Listen to this podcast. So I think it was a great pleasure or great honor or privilege to have a client tell me that she was excited to go on vacation so that she could catch up on listening to my show. So I guess, like, make sure I am having interesting conversations that are relevant to my clients is one way to do it.
Indeed.
Right. So make sure I'm delivering value. And then I think the other is, like, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted, or that I've kept doing my podcast, is that it gives me things to share, right? There are ideas and conversations that I have that I am excited about, that I'm learning about, and that I think that my clients will also enjoy learning about. So it's a content engine, but it's specifically like, here, this is something I think you will enjoy, or you might benefit, you might learn from. So yeah, I think that's make sure it's valuable and then tell them about it. That's the easy answer.
So let me dig a little bit into it then. How do you craft great conversation? And by that, I mean, it's so broad.
Yes.
As a topic, as an idea, right? Oh yeah, I'm going to have great conversation. Yeah, sure. That's what we all want. How do you make sure that in the episodes that you're recording, you're actually getting the most out of your guests, you're getting the most out of your episode, and these provide value to exactly the person that you wanted to provide value for, which is your client? How do you do that?
That is it's a really interesting question. And you're doing it right now, so this is super meta.
Conversationception.
For anybody listening who's had a conversation, I think there's always this tension between doing too much and doing too little.
100%.
And so in every conversation, certainly when you're interviewing somebody, I think there's this experience of, well, this is really great stuff. Oh, wait, where are they going with this? Or, wow, like, why aren't they getting to the point? And, you can try to keep interrupting somebody, but then it's like, if you keep, like, messing with a seedling, it never actually grows. So, like, you kind of have to be hands off at some point. And you also then need to be hands on and step in. So I think it is this stepping in and stepping out and feeling like you got to give them space to breathe, and then also stepping in as you are doing, saying, well, tell me more about this. When do you move on to the quote unquote next topic? I think one of the biggest dangers in any interview is, like, having my 12 questions that I'm trying to get through, and I'm going to ask all those 12 questions come hell or high water, and no, there's no opportunity for depth or follow-up, and the person feels like they've just been squeezed dry. And that's not a fun conversation for the person who I'm interviewing. So I think 1, choose good guests. 2, build rapport. 3, design a conversation structure that balances big picture and detail. And then am I at 3 or 4? Maybe I'm at 5. Collect the profits, right? Give them space, but also jump in. And I think it is a real challenge, but And I think what you're doing, which is a really interesting approach, is kind of starting in the middle, right? I think one of the challenges I think with a lot of podcasts, and look, I think it's something that people kind of expect or want, is like, well, tell me. And I've heard people be like, tell me what it was like to be you in junior high school. Like, take me way back to the beginning.
Such a good question.
I mean, it's an intense question. And guess what? Like, it was that person's brand, and they want to like take me back to the beginning and take me through exactly how you got here. Tell me about the process of writing your book. But then we don't get to the like, okay, what's the juiciest insight from your book, which is, our friend Barry O'Reilly, who we have in common, which is why we're having this conversation. One of his whole, concepts for one of his podcasts is take me to the second chapter. Like, don't just give me the overview of the book and the key talking points that everyone kind of gets to, but take me to the second chapter. So I feel like in a way, like any good story, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but very, very few stories actually start at the beginning. It's pretty boring to start at the beginning of the story.
I love that. Daniel, there is so much to unpack here. First thing I want to ask you is, I think that's going to tie in with preparation, spoiler alert. But if I go, so we are recording this 2nd of December 2024. Last episode is from October 30th about changing the political conversation, right? So about 5 days before election date in America.
Yes.
The episode before that is the secrets of motivation and systems change. Before that, it's like how to turn a conversation into a public park. Art that changes the conversation. Leadership in designing moment. Like you have, and it's very rare, such a variety of topics.
Yes.
How do you make sure that, back to my initial question, which is, with such a variety of topics, how do you make sure that you're going to actually get the most out of it? Because you cannot, logically, there is like less than a month time between 2 episodes. You cannot become an expert in all of those topics every time for the interview. So how do you do this?
Well, I mean, you don't have to be an expert in anything to have an interview with somebody.
Fair enough.
2, I think that's a mistake, and it's a mistake that I've made. Actually, if you listen to the conversation about changing the political conversation, which I loved, I think I studied too hard for that. And if you listen to it, there's actually a comment he makes where he's like, wow, you've clearly done your homework. Like, I think I teed up all of my questions a little too much. You're like, given X, Y, and Z, and you said this here, and I noticed this in your book, this you mentioned in another interview, and you said this in the documentary that you produced. Wouldn't you say that, in fact, this? And they're like, yeah, no, I agree. Like, it was such a well-formed, it was such a well-formed question where I was trying to demonstrate my own mastery of their topic out of respect for them, that like there was, I don't know if I left enough space for Nick to sing, but I really just wanted to highlight his ideas. And the reason, and I honestly had done that interview like maybe a month or so before. And I just was like, okay, I wanted to launch it close to the election to have maximum impact for his optics as well as for like where people's heads were. So I feel like, I don't know, you're also asking a question about like, I know that there's some people who are like, I'm a B2C consultant and I only talk to B2C. I only talk to businesses that are, B2C businesses, like, and that's it. And I think there's like a certain beauty and simplicity and directness that like, this is a podcast about podcasts and we interview podcasters, like
spot on.
And, but I guess for me personally, like there's just a value of an eclecticism and learning from parallel areas. And so that's just kind of my MO or my essence. So in a way, I like to interview all sorts of folks. And I just, I go to a lot of events, like that guy who, the artist, Benjamin Von Wong. I met him. He was speaking at a series in New York that actually is a global series. If you're in a city in the world and you don't go to Creative Mornings, it's every once a month. It's usually on Friday mornings. It's a really great lecture series. It's a really warm and welcoming community. And, they have it in New York. They have it in Berlin every place in between, like pretty much any city I've ever been to. Like
France.
there's France, there's two in Ukraine. Like there's two cities in Ukraine that have Creative Mornings chapters. So like you're like, wow, they're in Ukraine, like they're definitely in France.
One would hope so.
One would hope so. So I saw Ben talk, and he was just talking about an idea that I thought was really important. Not just art and changing the public conversation about biodiversity and climate change, but also through the lens of something that I'm like personally passionate about, which is thinking about things through tensions. And his talk was great. He was a great speaker. He's incredibly handsome. And like, I know,
Which
I don't even
adds to the mix.
Yeah, adds to the mix. Like he presents very well, and his art happens to be like on a really, really important topic about biodiversity and the impact of, you know, our activities on the globe. So I was very happy to like promote his work, but also get him to talk about something that I am currently passionate about. So to me, like all the most interesting books that I've read take some weird example, like some strange sideways industry, and they're like, you know, you may never have thought about how washing machines are invented, but here's the story of, and then there's an insight there. So to me, because I'm looking for like interesting stories, I'd rather go to a very unexpected place, and to balance that with as we say, like much more targeted. Here's an author who talks about leadership, who talks about communication, who talks about the things that I like to talk about, who can really speak spot on about those things. So I try to have a balance of on the nose and left field, maybe.
So this is actually something we've never shared on the podcast yet, but the way Hussam and I met, so Hussam, my co-founder of GHA Marketing, and we started all this with a podcast first. But back then, we just used to have great conversations. And it's so funny to reflect on this right now. I'm like, yeah, this all started because we just had amazing conversations about completely random topics. And we were just like, you know, becoming philosophical for like hours and just enjoying it. And then we're like, wait a second, I really appreciate the presence and like the exchange with that person. And we arrived to a point where we were discussing this, like, hey, how come you and I were able to have this level of conversations that we didn't feel with others always, right? So there is like a dynamic and an alchemy, obviously. But we also arrived to the conclusion that there is a certain level of being in the zone that is required to have this great conversation, not literally not seeing the time pass,
Yes.
to have it flowing. So I hear you when you say preparation is one thing, over preparation is another thing, though. But, and I mean, you've written a book about it, right? So
The book on it.
the book on it. My God, sorry, it probably is an English thing.
No. It's I'm being ironic. I literally have not written the book on it. There are so many books on this thing. But yes, please proceed. Sorry for interrupting you.
I mean, that's what you specialize in, right? That's literally all you do. So what does it take for somebody who would like to be, you know, having meaningful conversations that move you in a way? How would you recommend them to approach this? Like, is it a specific state of mind that you're in? Is it just like your curiosity that is tuned on? I'm just throwing some things here, but like, how do you do that?
When I was a boy. That's how far back do we go? Right. But here's the thing, actually, truly, we all learned, who taught us how to speak? Where did we learn how to converse? What are our models? Right. So we could think about things from so many different lenses. There's a classic model called triple loop learning. We just Google triple loop and learning. If you add my name to it, Stillman, I have a short article about it, but there's many people who've written about it. Chris Argyris and all sorts of organizational learning theoreticians have written about this. And there's this idea that you can do the right things in order to get to the goal. In fact, you have to do the right things. And there's a single loop where if you're not doing the right things, you don't get to the goal. If you're driving too far to the right on the road, you turn your wheel to the left to stay straight, right? If you're sending an email to somebody and they don't respond to the email, and you send them another email, and you send them another email, and you send them another email, you're doing the same thing over and over again, and you're expecting a different result. And in those instances, you need to change how you think, right? You have to start becoming empathetic or curious. You just have to at least notice, wow, I'm in a do loop. I'm in an insanity loop where I'm doing the same things over and over again, and I'm expecting a different result. And so conversations can be like this. You could say like, well, what can I do? Like, oh, have a plan. Pay attention to their facial expressions. Like, read them. Like, if you've lost them, do this, right? And people who are on the spectrum have to sort of hack that system. The problem is, look, I took this lens in my book. Like, there are definitely levers in conversation that allow you to quote unquote manipulate them. One that I'm doing right now on purpose is I'm just slowing down my pace. Right? Slowing down your pace, playing with your tone, allowing a little bit more space between your question and their answer. And, we know that there's facts of conversations. The average gap in a conversation between when one person asks a question or when you stop speaking and when it feels like there's just dead air is milliseconds, right? It's like the firing of a pistol, right? It's maybe around 400 milliseconds. And it takes someone about 600 milliseconds to think of a response. And so usually we kind of just fill the gap. When we think someone's done speaking, we start speaking more. And the one thing, and anybody here who's listening who wants to have better interviews, is just actually allow there to be more dead air than you feel slightly comfortable with. Or just say, that's interesting. Can you tell me more? And if you listen to NPR, National Public Radio here in the States, you'll notice how many people, it's so hilarious. They go, huh. They say this all the time. All the interviewers on all of the shows, somebody talks, they deliver a whole speech and they go, And then there's a little space. Now they're trying to move the conversation forward. They're trying to fill like 2 minutes or something. And so they don't say, can you tell me more about that? Or I heard you say this and this and this. Did I get you right? Like, is there anything else about that? Like, these are the true facts of how you get great conversations, because in the amount of time somebody has to speak, they could not have possibly said all the things that they're thinking, because we can think at 4,000 words per minute and we can only speak at 100, 125. So those are the things to like think about to change how you converse. Like, you can think about curiosity, but you can't think your way to you. I mean, it's true, you can fake it till you make it, but being curious is the third loop of learning, which is how you show up. Showing up curious, showing up patient, being willing to make some space for awkwardness. Those are all ways to host much more interesting conversations. And that's not something you do. You can do the actions of curiosity. Tell me more. I heard you say this. Is that right? Those are all the actions of curiosity, but you will do them very naturally if you be curious. If you, from a perspective, be like, there's no way this person has told me everything that they're thinking about this. I know this for a fact because I know that they've been thinking at 4,000 words per minute their entire life on the subject, and they've just only delivered 1 minute at 125 words per minute. There's no way they've packed all of their knowledge, insight, and wisdom into the amount of time that they've had to explain it. And so there's another thing that I think I've brought to conversations since I've become a student of it, which is just humble humility. Like, I'm ashamed at all the mistakes I've made in conversation, all the times that I've spoken over somebody when they were about to start saying something else, all the times that I've misunderstood somebody. And so I think on the be side versus the do side, like being curious and being humble are like the best things that you can do to create, I think more depth. But then you have to balance that curiosity and that humility with like, all right, let's pick up the pace, people. We got some marks to hit, which you might be thinking about now. You're like, Daniel's on a tear, but like, I've got 5 other things I want to think of. I want to make sure we hit on. And I think that's the dance.
Daniel, you have no idea how much I'm loving this right now. So no, I want this to continue forever. Let me throw you a
stand
curveball
with you on a mountain.
Here we go. You got it. I want to throw you a curveball here. So one of the conclusions that we arrived to with Hussam was that actually what we felt back then was that a lot of people, when they are having a conversation, when they listen, and for the people on audio only right now, I'm like putting quotation marks when I say this. When people listen, they are actually in fact already thinking about what can they say next, or how can they make that story relate to them and walk them through their own story.
Yes.
And I've been looking for ways to explain this to people who are doing this, and yet who don't understand why they are not getting the promotion at their job, or why they are not getting listened to properly, or why they lack charisma, however we want to turn it. What's your recommendation here? How do I get somebody to understand that and adapt to that? Because it's one thing to be like, oh, it's just because you're thinking about yourself and the way you are in the conversation, but you should actually be fully the other person's. I even struggle to formulate the question. What's your thoughts?
It's an interesting question. And what comes up for me is last week I had a coaching call with a prominent doctor who became aware that his conversational style was creating friction at work, right? Where he was telling people what the problem was, inserting himself into other departments and winding up with a lot of blowback. So my primary work is usually with founders and their senior teams around how they communicate and collaborate, how they think and persuade. And I think what was interesting about this particular guy was he had read so many books. He was halfway through mine. He'd read Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference. He had read Getting to Yes. He had read Difficult Conversations. He had read Crucial Conversations. He had read Radical Candor. And his head was like, I feel like there's an Instagram meme where it's like somebody's talking and you're like seeing all the math symbols go. And they're sort of like, ugh. And in a way, he was like, this is like overthinking it, right? And you can think about it so much where you're like, oh, wait, I should be actively listening to them. Or like, no, I should be doing a pattern interrupt. Or like, I should be like, but these two different books say like slightly different things about exactly what I should do in this moment. And you're not actually just paying attention to the person and listening to it like music. Like, okay, so like they're just talking to me and they're done talking. And all I have to do is like, say like, thanks for sharing that. Like, what else? His mind was a series of like mathematical equations, and the thinking about it was getting in the way of just him enjoying it. Now, like, obviously there's a beauty to like being an intentional practitioner and understanding the history and the philosophy and the techniques. But then there's also just being fully present and letting it all go. Mm-hmm. And I think, as with always, it is that yin and yang between those fundamental approaches and those fundamental tensions. Like if you could go in with no artifice, and I would I've never had the cojones to go into an interview with, because Larry King used to do this. He was like, no, I don't read the book. I don't read their book. He's like, everyone listening to their program hasn't read their book. So like, why? And I love that. I was like, oh man, like I don't have to go into their book. I don't have to read their book. Just be like, so why should people read your book? And then just start from there and then just keep interviewing. And Larry King was a great interviewer, but he was very calm. He was very chill. He was very present. He was very collected. So I feel like if you're going to have no plan, you have to be 100% present. And there's no plan that involves eliminating the need to be somewhat present, I guess. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
you are. I want to challenge you on it, Daniel, because but I suppose there is a whole logic behind it. But if somebody comes to me, first of all, okay, let's break it down like this. How do you get somebody to understand that they have a conversation problem? And let me just highlight a bit this, not highlight, but dig a little bit further into this question. If I'm having collaboration problem with my colleagues or any form of something is off here, I'm gonna potentially first think something is wrong about them, or they don't understand the rule, or they are not listening to me. How do you get somebody to be like, no, wait a second. Actually, you might just want to rethink how you're having conversations with them. How do you get people to acknowledge this issue?
So it's very hard I know, right? So you're asking a very subtle question, because to try and help someone who doesn't know that they need help is very hard. So I would not generally propose to wake a sleeping person, right? If they really don't know and they're not asking, it's it's sort of like we say, not my circus, not my monkey. Now, if somebody's coming to you and saying like, can you do an overall assessment of my podcast and what I'm doing well and where you think I might be missing out, and what am I doing wrong and what are some opportunities for growth? That's a rose, thorn, bud feedback model. I think it's one of the best ways to give anybody feedback, to say like, here's what's working well, because it creates psychological safety and like, cool, like I feel seen, I feel heard, like I'm doing something great. Here's what's really important to stop doing. And here's some things that I see are opportunities, things that are sort of not fully grown, but if you water them and give them some love and sunshine, they might grow to being a rose in the future. Rose, thorn, bud is a great way to just give somebody feedback if they are asking, right? And it's a way to make sure that I always try to make sure I'm giving them balanced feedback. Even if they say, tell me what I'm doing wrong, I'll still say, well, here's what I think you're doing right? I'll still say, here's what's working great. But if they're not asking, then we have to ask a question like, why is it my responsibility, right? So if a client comes to me and says, I'm having this problem, we're still in the context of I'm in a position where I want to help them. So if they say, I have a problem with this, they're open to the opportunity. Like, are you open to thinking about other ways that you might maybe you're causing this? Maybe it's this, maybe it's them, maybe it's 100% your responsibility. Maybe it's 100% their responsibility. Let's just consider both of those lightly. But that's still in the context of they're curious about being helped. I'm not sure if that was exactly your question, but if they are saying like, I have problem X and I just need this person to like do Y, I think if we're willing to be in the conversation and peel enough layers back, usually my perspective is there's a conversation somewhere that is at the source of it. Either it's a conversation that they're not having with themselves about what they want and what they need, or how they're not supposed to talk, or how they think they have to talk, or it's a conversation that they haven't had with someone else. And usually when I ask them, if we peel enough layers of the onion, I don't think anybody has ever failed to realize that there's a conversation somewhere that's broken in the process.
I love the analogy of the rose, thorn, bud. I didn't know it. In French, we say the shit sandwich. And it's like a nice little bread.
Yes. It's slightly different than the shit sandwich.
Yeah, because so the last one, the bud, right, is not just about doing another compliment, making another compliment. It's actually about something they feel stuck with or need support with that you're going to be here to help with. But I love the analogy.
It's not mine. It comes from the Boy Scouts of America.
We can say it's yours, Daniel. I'm fine with that. Another thing that you mentioned was, and that's the thing I want to challenge you on, was like, hey, you need to be present. But how do you operationalize being present, right? Because for you, and I hope me, I get what being present is. It's like, I mean, actually, for me, it's you cannot think of anything else exactly like I'm in this conversation right now. It's like you're just so into it that nothing else matters. You're forgetting about everything else. It happens when I climb as well, because you just have the fear of falling, and like you need to be in the moment. That's it, being present. But how do you operationalize that so somebody can understand what being present in a conversation means? Because for somebody who's not versed into this craft, it might be super hard to do.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, there's so many, there's some great classic mythological stories.
Okay.
In the Bhagavad Gita, there's a story of Arjuna, like he's aiming his bow and arrow, and they're like, what do you see? And he's like, I see a black circle. And they're like, what else? He's like, that's all I can see. And it's the eye of the bird. Like he sees nothing else but the eye of the bird. There's a classic story in the Zen tradition of like a monk who doesn't notice the whole procession going through the town because he's like carving something. And so I think there's like focus, but the question then becomes focus on what? I think one of the challenges is with conversation is that people don't often know what all the things are that they can be tracking. And that's anything. It can be tone, it can be pace, it can be facial expressions, it can be what's not said, right? The ability to hear not just what's being said and the spaces between what's being said and the pace of what's being said, but also like, well, what aren't they saying? How do they trail off? Like, where are they looking when they say things? Like, there's all sorts of, if you ask Chris Voss from the Never Split the Difference guy, he might, as some people do, it's like a lie detector test, right? It's like they tend to look up to the right when they say X, and they look down and to the left when they say Y, and they correlate and collaborate that because they're noticing stuff that you and I aren't noticing. But I think the easiest thing to notice is just push versus pull, right? Are they giving me more?
Okay.
Or are they giving me less? Is this picking up the pace? Is the pace kind of picking up, or is it slowing down? It's like when you go into a restaurant, like, is there a buzz, right? Is it happening? Right. And so just trying to tune in. And I think there's a lot of models for this, where there's like one of the classic models is, there's unawareness and then there's awareness. So there's like level 0 of listening. There's listening to yourself, like being aware of your own sensations, your own emotions, your own thoughts. And I think it's actually important, even in a conversation, like your brain is still going. And so it's important to know, like, oh, am I anxious? Am I anxious? Am I excited? Am I interested? Like, how do I feel? And then the next level of awareness is, well, what's going on with them? And then the third is the body, the third body. Like, am I anxious because they're anxious, or are they anxious? Am I excited because they're excited? Am I as excited as they are? Are we in the same place of excitement together? Or am I getting too far ahead or behind where they are? And so that's like matching energy. A lot of people talk about, this is an interviewing skill, just like if they go like with their arms crossed and their fist underneath their chin, you cross your arms and put your fist underneath your chin. And if they cross their legs, you cross your legs. And it's this very mechanical approach to mirroring. If they lean in, you lean in. If they lean back, you lean back. That's a mechanical approach. The other approach is like just feeling like, where are we? And so, yeah, people have to learn how to notice what they can notice. If you can notice and name it, you can, if you want to rhyme, if you notice and name it, you can claim it, you can tame it, you can track it. So people should just start noticing as much as they can. And that's just global awareness, like being aware of just as much as they can in the conversation. Now, like, look, my book, through my podcast, I developed my own point of view and I interviewed people and I tried to, like, what are the elements of a conversation? And I was like, here's 9 things, because it makes a nice grid. Some people would say that there's an infinity of things, but everyone, I think, has to decide for themselves, like, what is important to track and what they feel like they can actually, quote unquote, control, because there's not a lot you can control in the conversation.
So one would need to pay attention to the facial expression of the person they are speaking with, their body language, their tone, their pace, the way they lean forward or backwards.
Sure.
And being conscious of their own facial expression, body language, and so on and so on and so forth. So how long does it actually take to learn all this and to make it part of your natural self, so you're able to being present in the conversations?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, do we have a natural self? I don't even know sometimes. As
Probably
a chameleon, yeah, I'm like, who am I? I think, it goes to that story of the guy in the Zen story who's just so focused on his work that he doesn't notice the procession going by. Practice makes perfect. But I think intentional practice and reflection makes really perfect. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, this doctor might, is having conversations with me, because he wants to get intentionally better significantly faster than he would otherwise. In the same way that, like, if you want to get good at dancing, you get a one-on-one dance instructor. And if you, want to get better at fitness, you get a one-on-one fitness instructor. You have someone like watch you and see what you're doing. And so I think watching your own tapes is probably the best thing. And maybe one of the most difficult things you can do is just to, like, watch your tapes and say, oh, look, I did a good job there. I liked that. That's good. I see what I did there. And say, oh, that didn't work. And to say, like, you know what, that didn't really land, but here's some things I can think of that I could do better. That's just giving yourself your own rose, thorn, bud, and like watching your own material.
So I see how you can easily implement this, say, if you have a podcast, for instance, because you'd be in conversation all the time. But for that doctor client of yours, what? You tell them to bring on a camera on the job and like, yeah, you know, when you have conversations, super confidential conversations with your patients, just record it. Same with your colleagues. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's easier now than it has ever been before. Because I have a good friend who a couple of years ago had a startup that he wanted everyone to wear like a little recording badge. And it wasn't going to record actual speech. It would just record tone and pace and location.
Okay.
So he could basically develop a map of all of the conversations in an organization where you'd say like, oh, this person's having an energetic conversation with this one person at this one place and this one time. An organization is definitely like you could map an organization is just a system of conversations, who you're supposed to talk to, who you're not supposed to talk to, how you're supposed to talk to them, when you're supposed to talk to them. And in person, obviously it was a great technology and I believe what he was doing was a good idea. Obviously everyone was like, that sounds like a tremendous violation of my privacy.
Indeed.
No, thank you. Indeed. And they're like, but we're not actually recording what you're saying. It's sort of like when you were, like, it's like, and so it's like, that's what they were getting. They were like, it's the difference between, right. You're like, oh, okay. I can see the difference of that, but I don't know exactly what you said and we're going to anonymize it, whatever. He was like, people were like, no. He was ahead of his time. Now, with conversations on Zoom, it's very easy. And in fact, there are a ton of tools that will tell you your word per minute and the fact that you're actually speaking more than your conversational companion or faster than them. They'll notice things like that for you. Now, of course, they don't always know the context. I myself was in a coaching conversation for me with someone who was my coach, and I got a notification from the tool I was using that I was dominating the conversation by talking 70% of the time. And I was like, I think I'm supposed to be talking more than them.
Right.
But, and this is an open question. I've asked other coaches who I am in community with. I'm like, what's a good coaching conversation? Is it you talking 50% and them talking 50%? Is it them talking 85 and me talking 15? Or is it me talking 80 and them talking 15, where they tell me their problem so clearly and then I deliver like a huge download of everything that they need to know? What does good look like? Now, but we have digital tools now where even if a CEO that I'm working with doesn't feel comfortable with me sitting in on their conversations, watching them be with their senior leadership team, they can still record it and we can watch it together later because there's a lot of organizations that just record. As a matter of fact, I've sat in on those meetings, both in person and remotely. And obviously, there's the observer effect. Just me being there changes the conversation. Them knowing that they're being observed changes how they act. Everyone else knowing that I'm there changes how it is. And people also act differently when the conversation is recorded. So it's challenging, but I think it's not as hard to get the data these days as it perhaps used to be when, quote unquote, everything or more conversations were by default recorded. Obviously, I think about the observer effect and, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle as it relates to conversations, but, it's still better to have the recording than not.
So I'm a man of science, Daniel. Not at all. But let's pretend I am.
I mean, we're all men of science, right? Look at all the technology we have around us.
What are the quantifiable benefits that you've witnessed with your clients, for instance, going from having meh conversation, let's call them, to having great conversations that make a difference? How do you quantify that difference? Say if somebody is thinking about investing in themselves and investing in learning how to have better conversations, but they are really down to earth and men of science or women of science.
Yes.
And they're like, okay, but what's going to be the quantifiable benefits of this?
Yes.
How do you do that?
Well, I mean, what's the biggest deal you've ever made, right? I mean, you think about how much is a conversation worth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I actually remember when I interviewed some time ago my friend Leland, who at the time was the chief creative officer at Chobani, which is a big yogurt company in the States. They were like the Greek yogurt company and very innovative company. They were doing very, very cool stuff. And he and I were talking about whether or not a brand was a conversation or a negotiation. And he was of the mind that he's like, it's a negotiation. And I was like, tell me why. And it was partly because he had just gone to Harvard to a negotiation intensive. And he suddenly was looking at the world through the lens of negotiation. Negotiation is a type of conversation. And a negotiation is where one or more parties or multiple parties are having an intentional conversation to determine a preferred outcome, to try and get to an agreement. Now, that's all a conversation is. Party A, party B, point A, point of view A, point of view B, desire for an outcome or transaction, a commitment to working together in a new way on the other side. And I said to him, and at the time, this was like, God, almost 10 years ago, at the time, it was a $5,000 a week-long course. And I was like, that's expensive. And he was like, and now I'm like, that's pretty affordable because it was in person also. Like I've also, I'm doing better now than I was then, but also I'm like, he said to me, do you really think you're not going to make that money back on your first deal with a client? Do you really think you can't make $5,000 on more from your next conversation? And I was like, damn, okay. So this question of like, what's a conversation worth is very much like the classic Picasso question of what is this painting worth? You may know the story of he does this doodle on a napkin and this woman at the cafe realizes he's Picasso and says, oh my God, that's wonderful. Can I have that? And he goes, sure. Like it's, $1 million or $500,000 or 20, whatever he says. And she goes, $20,000, but it only took you 5 minutes to make. He says, madam, it's taken me my whole life to make this painting.
Right.
And I know for a fact that I've had conversations with my clients about going in and talking to senior leaders in their organizations if they were junior, or talking to their venture capital partners if they were the CEOs and they have venture capital partners, or talking with co-founders that they're on the rocks with. And what's the value of saving a marriage? What's the value of being able to pitch the CEO of a mega pharmaceutical company when you only have an hour with them and you've got to get the pitch right? And then it actually turns out you don't even get a chance to have the call, but you get to have a 15-minute call without your slides to the next the person who's in charge of the rest of the business in Europe. And they say, sure. Oh, you just want $11 million? Okay. But that's a real story. It's a 15-minute call with the person who can give you $11 million for your project. So is it an $11 million call? Like, how much is that conversation really worth? Because that $11 million is going to create hopefully billions of value for the company. So maybe it's $1 billion call. So a conversation can be worth billions of dollars. Like there's literally no question that if you look at it from the perspective of negotiation or loss aversion, even like what's the value of like reconciling with your co-founder and avoiding splitting up the company? Like it's incalculable. So to me, I think conversations are invaluable in the same way that a Picasso is invaluable. But it's really clear from like, and this isn't science, by the way, this is math, right? We're just saying like, how much is a conversation worth? And the answer is, it depends on who you're talking to and what the stakes are. But we've all been in conversations where asking the question, and this is a question I learned from my $5,000 week-long intensive at the Harvard Negotiation Institute, which is to say, thank you for sharing that number with me. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you got to that number?
Interesting.
Which is totally different than like, Jesus Christ, are you trying to screw me? Like, very different response than like, that is just an offensive number, or like, please, we won't do it for less than blank, right? Or I'm sorry, but the going rate is blank. Or I'm going to have to talk to my boss to see if we can do that. Or there's a million responses to when someone asks you for your number or when they give you their number, and how you actually handle that micro interaction, that micro conversation. Do you say, thank you so much for sharing your number with me. Can you tell me more about how you got to that number? You're just being curious and you're trying to get to legitimacy. You're not even implying that you agree with it or disagree with it. You're just trying to excavate and find out if there's any foundation on which that number was based. The answer is numbers are made up. And so, of course, you can recoup your $5,000 investment and your negotiation intensive on your first deal. So conversations are worth a lot to me. And it also depends on who you're talking to, right? And that's why, everyone has to choose their clients wisely. I mean, Alan Weiss talks about this. Like, you want to be talking to somebody where the ROI is very, very clear, and that you can offer them a 10x ROI, and that the cost of doing it poorly is unacceptable, where doing it well is the only option. So is that Mr. Science, Mr. Man of Science? How does that land for you? I mean, there's an elaborate and long-winded answer, but.
So I'm going to give you an answer, an indirect answer that I think is going to say it all. I'm smiling so much because of how good this is that my jaw starts to hurt. For me, you got me at what's the price of a conversation that could save your marriage? Because I'm like, yeah, quantifiable in terms of, so that first thing is like, what's the biggest deal you've ever signed? Which was out of a conversation, obviously, because if people didn't need to have conversations, they would just call you and say, I'm buying, but they are not.
Which means you're charging too little, by the way.
Exactly. So you're not making as much money as you should. But that's so funny in my conversations, because I took some sales training, and like the guy was saying, you should expect the when you give the price. Like if you don't get the it's like you're not pricing high enough, or you're not credible. And it's like, and then it's a conversation about how can you get there.
Right. And that's noticing that.
Yeah.
So part of conversation design is noticing that. And people have probably seen Gary Vee talk. I just saw this video recently when somebody asked his price for giving a talk, and he was just new in that. And he was like, 5,000. They were like, okay. And he's like, shit, I charged too little.
Yeah. Oh no, actually it was 10,000. Oh yeah. Okay.
Well, yeah. Cause they were like, oh, it's actually an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, oh, well, for an hour, it's actually this. But some people don't notice that. Some people see that moment where they go, oh, sure. And they go, oh, yes. They said, yes, cool. I want low friction. And I think that's a real interesting choice. Some people are much happier to charge something that clients will say yes to easily because they want to have low friction. And they're okay with undercharging because they'd like them to see that they're getting 2, 3, 4x value of what they're giving. And these are choices. So you are looking for, and that trainer you worked with is looking for the, ooh, and because they want to try and get the most out of that conversation. But getting less and feeling like you're giving more is also a choice. And maybe that person's looking for that's great. Why are you charging so little? That's what they're looking for, which is fine, right?
Gold.
It's a choice, right? I like to make it feel real easy for my clients.
100%.
You can always charge me more if it feels like I can always charge you more if it feels like you're getting too much value for what you're paying me.
We'll have that conversation afterwards. Daniel, this is just so good. And by the way, I just wanted to bounce on something that you mentioned and follow up on it. It's funny, you see, I always thought a brand was an association of ideas, of principles, of outcomes. Not the negotiations. So that was interesting to get.
Well, I'll send you Leland's interview, and you can decide whether you agree with him or not. See, I'm going to get you to listen to my podcast on your off hours.
Would love, boom, and that's how you get listeners, folks. If you're listening to this right now, that's how you get listeners. Would love that, Daniel. Would love that. What's the name of the guest?
Leland Mashmeyer. He is a very, very brilliant individual. And it's an older episode, but it's as we pointed out, podcasts. If it's a good conversation, it's evergreen.
We'll definitely, okay, got it.
Oh, you found it.
We'll definitely listen to it. Yeah, good talk. How to design conversations that matter with, I probably butchered his name. Daniel, this was an absolute masterpiece.
I've been studying my whole life for this.
Yeah, no, that was so good. It was so good. I'm actually speechless. So if people want to get more of this, where should they go?
Oh, well, I mean, my podcast is theconversationfactory.com/listen is where you can get to the podcast. And if you are curious about, my main line, which is me as an executive coach, where I work with people on their conversational intelligence, their leadership from a conversational lens, that's just danielstillman.com. It's pretty straightforward.
Amen to that. We'll put all the links in the description. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the great questions and the attentive listening and great follow-up questions.
It was my absolute pleasure.